Mein Kampf is one of the most fascinating books ever written. Firstly, it's an autobiography of someone who is insane, which is always interesting. Secondly, it is also a political manifesto. And thirdly, it is this weird prophetic book. It foretells the future, makes a prediction, and it actually happens. So in this video series, we are going to be breaking it all down, analyzing everything, and really getting to the core of what Hitler believed and how he came to some of these crazy conclusions. We have a lot of people trying to psychoanalyze people like Adolf Hitler and try to judge them from afar, but most people don't do it in their own words. This is Hitler's own book. This is what he genuinely believed. And he was being very honest when he wrote this. So this is a dissection of Hitler in Hitler's own words. But more on that in a moment. Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley. This is History for Thinkers. Be sure to subscribe to the channel or follow the podcast for more content just like this. And without any further ado, let's get right into the analysis. So this author's introduction is kind of interesting. Firstly, because he kind of makes this memorial to some of the National Socialist Party members who died when they were trying to overthrow the Bavarian government. And, keep in mind, he's writing this book in prison, and these are guys that died trying to help him overthrow the government. I think it's really important to remember how unlikely everything happening the way it did was. At this point, you would have guessed that this was the end of the Nazi Party right here in this prison cell. And the fact that these guys get commemorated in this book and, Hitler later eventually does actually take over the government, it's just such a long shot. So I think in that way of looking at things, I think these guys kind of lucked out, because I don't think even in their wildest dreams would the Nazi Party have become as powerful as it eventually became. He also notes that this book particularly is for people who already belong to the National Socialist movement. He really kind of goes on how the spoken word is how these big movements that change things happen, right? And he was not wrong there, right? Because his speaking ability was much better than his writing ability. And while speaking generally, it's easier to listen to someone speak than it is to read their books, right? There are very few examples throughout history of people amassing these big, great movements through the written word. And before we even go any further, I think it's important to note why it's important that he puts this autobiography section toward the beginning of Mein Kampf and then talks about the politics after. You see, Hitler's goal with Mein Kampf and Nazism in general was to replace or kind of create a new religious identity movement. Really, if you look at Nazism, they were trying to replace religion in some way. And Hitler wanted himself to be at the center of people's hearts and minds. He didn't want them thinking about Jesus anymore. He wanted the people thinking about him. What would Hitler do? That's what he wanted people to be thinking. And we can talk more about that in another video, but I just think that's important to mention right from the get-go. So this first part of Mein Kampf, he talks a little bit about the situation with Germany and Austria. You see, Austria belonged to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and it was a very diverse empire, a bunch of different languages, people groups. You had parts of the Balkans and different Slavic groups, and there was actually a German minority. And Hitler belonged to this Austrian-German minority within this weird empire, this extremely diverse little thing in the center of Europe. And he talks about the situation with that and how it kind of paints how he sees a lot of European politics in general, right? why are we, us Austrian Germans, I mean, we're the same as the guys over in, Deutschland, we are just like them. We speak the same language, have the same heritage and everything. But why aren't we part of that kingdom? Why aren't we over there with them? And that really paints the way he's going to see the world throughout the rest of his life. I mean, I think if you took that element out of Hitler's mind from the time he was a child, I think the Nazi movement would have been extremely different. And let's not forget, it wasn't like he was some random racially charged person that happened to live in Austria. There were a lot of people that were just like him, that were these Austrian Germans who wanted to unite with the fatherland. When we saw the rise of nationalism, it really gave birth to this idea that people groups should be united and they should just have their own country, right? So if we all have the same culture, same heritage, we speak the same language, we should just be given our own state, and then we should, be able to collectively make decisions together on how we want to live our lives, because that's just the best way to do things. And the reason that so many people wanted Austria to be united with Germany was because, the bigger the state, the more power you have, the more people you have, more manpower, more money, more tax revenue. Throughout most of European history, all of these German states were extremely divided. They did not really work together. And because of that, they were all independently pretty weak. Not really that significant. They got bossed around by France and Russia for a really long time. And it kind of sucked. And now that there is this idea of nationalism, of uniting the German people, that kind of gets implanted on not just Hitler's mind, but a lot of people. Also, a little disclaimer, let's not forget that idea, uniting the German-speaking peoples, is not inherently bad in and of itself. There were a lot of people that believed in that were they weren't Nazis, that they were fairly center of the road or otherwise decent people. Because guess what? It just had never been done before. No one had united all these Germans. People of the same blood should be in the same Reich. That's what Hitler believed, and that's what a lot of people believed. And he even mentions here that the German Empire should not even engage in colonial policies until it has all of the German-speaking peoples inside of this one state, the Reich. And of course, he does what he can to try to make his hometown, that's somewhere on the border, it's technically in Austria, but it is close to Bavaria. It's really close. So, you can understand why he had this Bavarian kind of accent. And he tries to make it as significant as he can, right? He's like, I was just born on the center, the bridge between these two places, destined to unite them, right? Kind of this dramatic, hyperbolic way that Hitler loved to do things. Even talks about Johannes Palm, an uncompromising nationalist and enemy of the French, who was put to death for his love of Germany. Honestly, for all the bad things you can say about Hitler, he was really good at propaganda. Really good. I mean, I'm sure the people that lived within the Third Reich and they read this, I'm sure they were really caught up in it. They were like, wow, so great. We've just always been persecuted by those darn Frenchmen. Something that is very well known about Hitler's childhood is that he was abused by his father particularly, but that he feared and respected him. And in this early part of Mein Kampf, I think I'm on page, it doesn't even have the page, it's probably page 3 or 4 into it. And he talks about how his father was basically the self-made man, how he left home at a really young age, 13, and made something of himself, became, this working guy, and just worked his way up all the way to the point where he became some kind of a bureaucrat for the state, a civil servant, as if that was a good thing. And I also find it kind of weird how he calls his father to be self-made. I don't know about the cultural differences between Americans and, 20th century Germans, I just don't think you can ever call a government bureaucrat self-made. Maybe that's just my American bias speaking, but I just find it kind of weird and a little silly. So one of these big problems that Hitler's going to have early on in his life, especially between him and his father, is the issue of what exactly he's going to do when he grows up. You see, his father is just this overbearing, you're going to do things my way kind of dad. Just the kind of guy he was. And Hitler, well, he says it right here, I was quite out of sympathy with the kind of career which my father had followed. So he didn't want to do something quite as practical. Well, we know in retrospect that he wanted to become an artist. And, well, that's going to cause a lot of friction between the two. And that's actually never going to get resolved. Hitler's dad, he's going to die before they ever make up. And as much as he may have butted heads with his father, I think that there is a certain impression that gets left behind. Now, Alois, Hitler's father, had been particularly pro-government, kind of an expansionist, probably antagonistic to the French, we're not really sure. But the thing is, he had a lot of these books that, the kind of German history you might expect. So Hitler was getting into these books and reading them, and it sparked an enthusiasm for war, military intervention, expansionism that is going to have a lasting effect for quite a while. And then he also has some of these questions about the difference between the Germans and the Austrians. So why did Austria also not take part in it? Why did not my father and all the others fight in that struggle? Are we not the same as other Germans? Do we not all belong together? So you can see from this very early age, if what he's saying is true, right? Because he could have written this in some kind of retrospect to try to idealize himself in his own childhood. But I think he was being honest. I don't think he had to lie or exaggerate anything. I think as a kid, he probably was asking these questions, thinking about these kinds of topics. So here's a good line. The characteristic pride of the self-made man urged him towards the idea that his son should follow the same calling and, if possible, rise to a higher position in it. Again, I think the whole self-made man thing is a little weird, but his dad wants him to go into government work. That's what he wanted. And this is one of the many ironies that you'll discover when you study Hitler's life and his writings, that even though he rebelled and rebelled and rebelled against his father, he ends up working in the government as a bureaucrat anyway. It did not, it was going to happen one way or the other. And in response to Hitler telling his dad that he's going to become an artist, what does Alois say? Artist, not as long as I live. Never. So, there you go. That is how things are going to be between the two of them. And it's just so weird because when you have these crazy authoritarian parents that try to force their will upon their kids, what happens is that the kids, they just do what they're going to do anyway. Instead of it being oh yeah, I might become an artist. I kind of like drawing and it's kind of cool. It's kind of fun. That would be really nice. Instead of it just being something like that, it becomes, okay, well, my dad said no, so I have to become an artist now. It's the only thing I'm going to pursue and take seriously. So here's an interesting little part. When I look back over so many years and try to judge the results of that experience, I find two very significant facts standing out clearly before my mind. First, I became a nationalist. Second, I learned to understand and grasp the true meaning of history. So this first little part, I became a nationalist, is pretty straightforward, although it's important to point out that he was not a nationalist in the sense that he was pro one country or the other. It's more so that he was in favor of this theoretical nation state that encompassed every single German, which is kind of different from nationalism generally speaking, because there were German nationalists within the German Empire, right, the Reich, that didn't really care about Austria or didn't want Austria to be part of it. And he kind of differentiated himself along this ethnic line, right? So he would have, I think a more accurate term to have put here would have been an ethno-nationalist, but I don't think it was really in use at the time, so we can forgive him for that. Now, the second one, though, is a little bit more tricky. So I learned to understand and grasp the true meaning of history. And whenever someone says something like that, listen, man, I've got the answer to history. I know how it all works. I understand it. The answer is in my mind. I just gotta tell you. Whenever someone says stuff like that, you kind of have to be extremely skeptical. Because when you study and learn from objective history, like things that actually happened, non-biased sources, first-hand documentation, I mean, you look and you see there is no true meaning of history. Now, are there lessons and ideas that you can take away from history? For sure. Definitely. I wouldn't be running History for Thinkers if I didn't think there was some truth in that. But the idea that there is a true meaning, like one true interpretation of history, that is not only dangerous, but it's just wrong. It's not true. Because if you go into studying history with whatever lens you want, you can find and nitpick certain examples of whatever you want and fit your narrative that way. I mean, that is exactly what Karl Marx was doing with his whole idea of communism and revolutions, right? Because his basic conception was that there was a ruling class that abused the under people, right? The lower classes, the proletariat. And then the proletariat had a revolution, and then things got better until eventually a new ruling class came in and exploited all the proletariats again. It was this constant cycle of revolutions. And if you go into history and you read, I mean, you can definitely see the patterns, but it's more of a confirmation bias than it is anything else. You can go into history with whatever view of life or historical events that you want, and you can find good examples and make an argument, which is, again, why it's important to study objective history and see multiple points of view, not just one or two. So he kind of talks about how it was being an Austrian-German kid in school. I think it's almost a little comical because I just can't imagine this is how kids in school acted. So he talks about how, there's all these anti-German people that were teaching in the schools, and all of us, German kids, we would contradict them in unison, and we would just disobey them, and we were happy to be penalized for disobeying them and showing loyalty to the German nation. I just don't think kids really care that much about this kind of stuff. I mean, maybe it was a different time. Maybe. I'm not saying it's totally untrue. I just think it's probably a little exaggerated, especially the way he puts it. I mean, he even talks about them greeting each other with hell, and instead of singing the Austrian anthem, we sang our own Deutschland über alles, which is the national anthem for Germany, by the way. Also, the German Empire. But I just can't imagine kids being that motivated by ethno-nationalism. Again, some of them maybe to an extent, but I think this is where Hitler kind of really spins the propaganda machine a little bit too far, and it just sounds a little goofy. I mean, he's talking about 12 and 13-year-olds. I mean, if kids can find some angle to rebel, they will. I don't know. Maybe they did. I just think it's a little weird. So here's a really important paragraph right here. I developed very rapidly in the nationalist direction, and by the time I was 15 years old, I had come to understand the distinction between dynastic patriotism and nationalism based on the concept of folk, or people, my inclination being entirely in favor of the latter. So, really, what he's saying here is that he favors being pro our people as opposed to our country. And let's just break that down a little bit, right? Historically speaking, there are two big factors that can unite a people. Generally, it's culture, especially based around ideas and language. And then there is this ethnic lens, right? Like, which is kind of uncommon throughout history. I mean, when you look most of the examples throughout history, there's some combination of both. But generally, I think the better countries, you will see, I don't know, that's a subjective term. I don't want to make a judgment call, but generally, countries that are based around ideas tend to have a little bit more, I don't know, stability. They last a little bit longer. There's just something more to them. Those are the countries that become empires. We can look at a couple of examples, right? Look at Rome. They really did not have some kind of like DNA test that they did for Roman people to rise in the ranks. Were most of them like Southern European Italians? Like, yeah, for the most part, yeah. But it was just a coincidence if there were any people that were of whatever stock, whatever origin they had been, like they were more than welcome to rise through the ranks of the Roman system. Even look at the examples of the British or the French empires. Both of them had extremely strong, colonial ties, right? All these countries that they colonized, a lot of the people in those colonial territories joined the military for the French or the British. Like, it just happens that way. And when they are unified under these ideas of whatever they may be, generally things like liberty, freedom, equality, stuff like that. They are unified by these ideas, higher abstract ideals, rather than, oh, hey, we're all, the same. We all look the same, right? Let's form a country. I mean, you can see why it holds people together a little bit more. And I think part of the reason that this nationalist conception, that it's like nationalism through race or through people, part of the reason that it happens so much less frequently is because, like, at the end of the day, most people just don't really care. I don't think that this, like, don't get me wrong, this ethnic way of viewing the world has always existed. We constantly try to find new and interesting ways to categorize and divide people. But, like, when it comes to, like, practice and, like, really putting your money where your mouth is, I don't think most people really care that much. And, like, not just today, but for most of time. I mean, all of the people that lived under the Habsburg monarchy, the thing that really united them was Christianity. These higher ideals that are beyond just peoples, right? I think, it's just a little bit better to organize your nation through the lens of, okay, these are good ideas. Let's all be based on these ideas, as opposed to just some kind of biological herd. Now, I find this one line particularly interesting because it's a criticism that I've made myself. So he says, few teachers realize that the purpose of teaching history is not the memorizing of some dates and facts that the student is not interested in knowing. Like, I just find that so fascinating. Because it tells me that times have really not changed. Like, people get together, like, all right, we're going to have state history class. What are we going to tell the kids? Well, let's get them to memorize some dates and facts. I guess it was true back then in Germany, or, well, Austria. And it's true even today. So, funny how some things just really don't change. Episode number 2 will be linked down in the description as well as the pinned comment when it is released. Thank you so much. This has been Michael McCauley at History for Thinkers. I will see you in the next one. Peace out.